I got that good.
Loud and clear.
Okay.
Better toll.
That'd be my only contribution to this episode.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Talking TWAMPs. My name is Jacob Cordes, and I'll be hosting the episode this week where we'll be talking about the Hong Kong protests. Before we get into that, let's introduce our panelists.
Hello, I'm Sam. I'm a senior here at the college, and you won't hear from me a lot.
Hi, I'm William Moore, also senior here at the college, studying government and economics, and I actually find this one very interesting. Kind of sucks, though, for the Hong Kong protesters.
Okay, I don't not find it interesting.
Hello, my name is Vincent. I am a senior at the college studying economics and data science. I'm Asian, if that matters. I was in Indonesia. I actually went to Beijing over the summer. And so I've had a couple close calls with Hong Kong, especially because my flight transited into Hong Kong 4 hours before the protesters came in and shut everything down. So there's that.
Okay, so we're going to get some first-person reports.
Yep.
And I'm Blake Phillips. I'm at current geographically the closest to China, which, based on Sarah Palin's logic, qualifies me the most in this debate. So I look forward to absolutely wrecking you all.
Okay, the voice from beyond the grave or from beyond graduation, either way.
What's the difference, really?
What's the difference?
So let's start off because we know our listeners are all very educated and caught up on the news, but just in case somebody's been out of internet range for the past month and a half, what's going on in Hong Kong, guys?
I'll take this one. No, I'm kidding.
So these protests all started with a very controversial bill that went through the Hong Kong devolved legislature. So for those who don't know, Hong Kong is a weird administrative district inside of China that has many liberties and independent governmental powers that the rest of the provinces of China do not have.
This is, of course, because Hong Kong was borrowed to the British in its history.
Yeah, so China obviously had a totally fair trade deal where they gave Britain a 99-year lease on the port city of Hong Kong after the Opium Wars. And
not fair.
Basically, Hong Kong grew up under the control of its empirific parent, the United Kingdom, so it still has a lot of similarities culturally that you would see with the United Kingdom, including, a love of financial business. So Hong Kong is an extremely wealthy city. It's also and it has a lot of civil liberties that other places in China don't have. However, in the most recent times with the most recent legislature, they have introduced a controversial extradition bill that would allow the Hong Kong government to extradite citizens of Hong Kong to the mainland of China to have them face criminal prosecution in China.
This is bad because a lot of detractors of China are in Hong Kong, and that would allow basically China to come into Hong Kong and take them away to be ruled in a Chinese court in the mainland of China.
Which chances favor are going to be significantly harsher than domestic courts in Hong Kong.
So let's talk about...
Which is largely due to the fact that there is no presumption of innocence in mainland Chinese courts.
Yeah, so there's a lot of legal, issues wrapped up in the incitement of this protest. Let's talk a little bit, though, about that legislature, because, we think about in the United States, obviously you vote for the members of your legislature, and then you vote for whoever the executive is going to be. But that's not quite how it works in Hong Kong, right?
So, in short, the Hong Kong legislature is a puppet of the PRC, or the Communist Party of China, simply because after Britain's departure from Hong Kong, China has been encroaching very, very systematically against Hong Kong civil liberties, basically. For example, Carrie Lam, the executive, thank you. The executive is very much in the pocket of the PRC. So that's already problematic because the top dog in Hong Kong is already a puppet of the communist regime.
I wouldn't go so far to say they're puppet, though. They are elected in Hong Kong, though I will admit it's a 50-50 split on how they're elected, because there's 70 members of the Legislative Council. 35 of them are elected by geographic constituencies in the city of Hong Kong. 35 of them are elected through constituencies that are called basically trade constituencies that have limited membership. But they are, at the moment, the majority in the Hong Kong legislature, 43 of the legislators are kind of more pro-Beijing,
Which is the first time that has ever happened in the Hong Kong legislature. Was this election was the first time that it ever tipped pro-Beijing.
There you go. I did not know that.
I actually did not know that either.
And obviously, obviously the central government has taken advantage of this, kind of encouraged them to pass this extradition bill. So let's talk about the aftermath of, and they haven't even actually passed the extradition bill, right? It was just proposed.
But it's still technically in the legislative docket, because Beijing refused to let them take it off the docket. The executive tried to take it off the docket, but Beijing ruled that they could not.
Yeah. So let's talk about the aftermath of this getting added to the legislative agenda. There have been, it would be charitable to call these protests, right? But it's been quite a bit more involved than that, right? It's more complicated than that.
Well, the wordplay segment is interesting because it's been called protests in the West and perhaps in the South China Morning Post, the more anti-Beijing sentiment. However, in mainland China, where I've been, they're just simply called the Hong Kong problem or the Hong Kong riots, which have altogether a different sentiment, meaning that, these are riots, these are bad times, these people don't know what they're doing, they have it good. Instead, look at them burning down stores and looting. And, not the kind of pro-democracy party and struggle for your civil liberties approach that we've heard in the West. Other than that, I think it's interesting to note that the leader of the Umbrella Revolution, Joseph, that's not Joseph. His last name is Wong. But if you remember the Umbrella Revolution at the time, he is back in action and has already gotten detained already. So it's his third time, I think, into his third foray into Chinese prison. So there's that. Joshua Wong, thank you. I think Joshua Wong. Yeah, sorry, not Joseph. Joshua Wong and other pro-democracy figures have been arrested. I think it was 2 weeks ago.
Notable. And of course the kind of breadth of arrests has been, it's been quite broad. The police in Hong Kong are detaining basically anybody who's on the street at this point. What do you guys see as being a positive outcome for these protesters?
Nothing in the long run.
I don't know that we can really start marking what the outcomes are quite yet. I mean, you're right, Jacob. They're detaining people left and right at this point. It doesn't look like the protests are going to survive, at least in their current form, for too much longer. But I think that if we're going to talk about positive outcomes that have happened to this point, the major one is obviously the Western attention. These sorts of protests in China, in India, in places like that get reported on sort of matter-of-factly by the international branches of most major news outlets in the U.S. from time to time. Some headline like there were protests in Hong Kong today. Moving on, look how cute this puppy is. But this particular protest, perhaps owing to its larger nature, perhaps owing to the way that the Chinese government has responded to it, has garnered a lot more Western interest. And in fact, even managed to get Donald Trump, of all people, not exactly the champion of Western ideals and liberalism, to actually applaud something that could very well derail his trade agreement attempts.
Well, I think what's also important is that a lot of people are tying these to be similar to the Tiananmen Square incidents and massacre that occurred, because for a brief period of time there was a lot of reporting on Chinese military units forming up outside of Hong Kong.
That's true. They rotated in.
Yeah. And it very much looked like that the Chinese military was going to solve the question of the Hong Kong protests with violence. That would be very interesting to see how that plays out, especially in an international sphere, because the international perspective of this is perhaps the more significant portion of it. I don't think Hong Kong on its own can survive against Beijing. But the question is how... Sorry, Blake?
I was just going to say, it's worth noting that the other reason that Hong Kong gets a lot of Western attention is that it remains a very large financial district. It's extremely important for Western business connections to the East. So the international interest in Hong Kong is not merely humanitarian. It's also that if tanks were to roll into the banking district of Hong Kong, it would disrupt Asian markets, considerably.
Well, and it doesn't necessarily have to be tanks. The protests have already created a huge disruption, especially because there are basically three major stock exchanges in East Asia: Beijing, Tokyo, and Hong Kong. With all of this activity in the streets, it's basically meant a shutdown of trading in Hong Kong. So is this a positive thing, though, that they've managed to bring in outside Western attention? And what really good does Western attention do if they're not going to intervene?
Well, that's the question. Western attention is worthless if the West doesn't intervene or it doesn't somehow damage China in the long run. The only way that
I disagree. China is a weird international actor. Normally, when you have an authoritarian regime whose stability is rather unquestioned, they aren't that open to sort of just soft power pressure from international, actors. But China's been oddly receptive in the past to sort of slight changes in policy based on international pressure that doesn't necessarily have to be full-on intervention. I mean, for instance, the whole concentration camp deal that they've been doing in the northwest
Xinjiang region.
Yeah, they're still doing it. Don't get me wrong, but they felt that they needed to address it even after Western countries essentially just dragged them in front of the UN and said "bad China," and so they've said they claim that they've begun releasing people. And again, it may not be a super concrete action, but that's in a region where surveillance is almost impossible. We have live camera feeds to Hong Kong in a lot of instances just because Western businesses can set up their own electronics in the area. And I think that there's a real possibility that the reason China didn't use military force in Hong Kong is because they knew that if they did, there would be an international outcry that they would not be able to, because they're economically sensitive. China needs international markets.
Well, and that's what I was trying to ultimately get to, is that the way that this affects China is indirectly, probably not through national governments trying to affect China, because we've seen the U.S. is already embroiled in its own problems with China in the trade war. There's not really much more we could do beyond just, I guess, continuing to ratchet up sanctions to try to enforce that.
There is one thing we did. We sold more F-17s to Taiwan.
Yeah, we did.
During the time.
That is true.
There's that,
Which,
however.
Dope move. That was hilarious.
Yeah, that was actually pretty cool. Go on with him. Sorry, I just wanted to point that out.
Yeah, no, I agree. But it's a matter of Chinese perspective, I would think, is that this soft power issue. China wants to portray itself as this new rising power of a civilized nation. We kind of saw it with the Beijing Olympics back in 2008. That was the first big one where China really came on the scene. If they start rolling tanks down the middle of the street running over people and solve this militarily, that basically undoes much of the narrative they've been trying to construct about China for about the past 15, 20 years. And that's I don't think the Chinese government, I think, would eventually be willing to do it if it really got out of control, but they're not willing to do it just yet.
The question is...
So does that not countermand your argument that China doesn't respond to anything short of intervention? I think that that's a pretty compelling argument that China can reasonably be pressured to do things just to keep a very well curated image in the international sphere, not pristine, but at least clean enough that it can be considered dealable.
Well, I think it just depends on the nature of the intervention per se. Like, when I think of intervention, at least governmental intervention, I think of that like actual sanctions, which China has shown that at least in the current time, it's willing to weather to a certain extent, especially against the United States. So if the U.S. decided to unilaterally do something, yeah, I think China would just say, okay, whatever. But if like Europe and most of the rest of the world also hopped on like a UN style issue, then maybe, but I'm not sure.
I want to point out I think we made this link earlier. I think William said it, that a lot of people are comparing this to Tiananmen Square or the massacre that happened there. I'd like to point out that the power of the internet now plays a very big role. Because when I was in Beijing studying Mandarin, I got a little bit edgy and asked a couple of people whom I trust, who are from Beijing, and I asked them what they thought about the incident that happened in Tiananmen, at this particular time, to which they responded, I thought it was just a couple like rabble rousers that were, shooed home. And I asked, just how many rabble rousers did you think appeared? And they said 20, probably. And so for a lot of people in Beijing, they have no clue what this Tiananmen massacre is. For them, this is a bastardization of what happened in China, and it was just part of the Western agenda to topple China's rise and I guess China's recovery out of the century of humiliation, as they put it. But today, we can't. It's very difficult for China to pull such a cover up. They can no longer, shut down all sorts of media's pictures, reportings of this event like they did with Tiananmen, because the internet is now sent word of what's happening in Hong Kong all over the world. And so while I agree that this is very Tiananmen-esque, especially with the rolling of the military lorries into Hong Kong, we have to thank the internet, because now we have the ability to mobilize on a grassroots level, even if it's just through, I don't know, Reddit or something like that. At least people understand.
Well, so I agree with you, Vince, in one sense, but like, I guess I would say that the role of media is a double-edged sword, because in some ways that's not the right word. The ubiquity of media to all these people in China actually, if you have people, like you would think that, like the reason that, I hate the word fake news, but like in some ways it's actually easier to influence people today, and it's more like,
I guess with like propagandistic information.
Exactly. So if you have a large body of people in mainland China who are receiving information from sources that attempt to present the Hong Kong problem, however we are going to call it, protests in a certain light, you could actually have a more pervasive and faster acting sort of, I guess I'll call it a brainwashing that you had similar to the Tiananmen Square incident. But I do agree. I think that if I had to make a guess, I think that you could have on a global level, you're going to have a greater sense of what's actually going on in Hong Kong. But I think that you could have in mainland China, with manipulation of the media, you could actually have a greater like manipulation of what mainland Chinese people think of what's going on in Hong Kong.
I mean, I guess Sam, the question really
I fully agree with you, but I don't think that that's what undermines Vince's point the most. I think what undermines it the most is that he called them lorries.
All right, Blake.
How dare he use the language of the British oppressor.
Well, it's Hong Kong. British oppression is kind of the local dialect.
I did think it was pretty funny that
I don't want to go that far.
That their symbol of freedom that they decided to put over the symbol of the Hong Kong legislator was the British colonial flag for Hong Kong.
Yeah, I saw those pictures. I thought
they put up the flag over when they stormed the legislator, and it's like, There's a certain irony here. It's like that.
The best period of our history was when we were as mere slaves to an economic engine that spanned the world.
Yeah, it's like...
All right.
As opposed to what they are now.
Yeah, it's like...
Ooh, okay, I like that take.
Okay, so we're wrapping up our little micro episode here. But before we go, I'll leave you guys with one more question that we're going to kind of pass around the table. And that is, what's on the horizon for Hong Kong? Obviously their position as kind of an extraterritorial island on its own is a little unstable. So what's in their future? Are they going to be reabsorbed into the kind of whole of the People's Republic, or can they find their own path? So we'll let you think about that for a second. But before we do answer that, we are obviously not an official representative of the college. All of the opinions expressed here are very much our own, especially if any Chinese government censors are listening.
Yeah, we have to keep them off the college's back because we got a Confucius Institute on site, and that's just paid for by the Chinese government. They're Chinese propagandists, a lot of them.
And if you enjoy getting all of your news from a bunch of college undergrads and one graduate,
Yay!
You can find us by searching Podcasting Network at William & Mary and going to our Spreaker site, or search Talking TWAMPs wherever you get your podcasts. And if you like this podcast, we've got better ones. You don't have to listen to this.
I got a pretty good podcast. Don't listen to my podcast. That's the name.
So what is in the cards for Hong Kong, Vince?
I think that Hong Kong needs to play a better game of chess with the Chinese government here, because, I feel like they are pushing the envelope a little bit too much, and I hate saying that because I believe truly in what they want. They want their civil liberties, they want human rights, they don't want basically what's happening in the Xinjiang province where the concentration camps are being set up. However, if they continue to, I guess, too recklessly push the envelope, they will get shut down. And, the U.S. can protect Taiwan because they have a different set of geological features, like a larger strait in between them. However, Hong Kong is much difficult. Hong Kong is much more difficult to protect in that traditional sense. And if they're not careful enough, one small contingent of the Chinese military may very well just sweep up and make easy work of the rest of the protesters, and they have to be careful. It's like playing those estimation games when we were younger. Like, you could estimate up to a certain amount, but if you guessed above the number of marbles in the jar,
are you talking about
lose.
The Price is Right?
I guess, yeah.
I was
or that
thinking
TV
Blackjack,
show.
so that proves
You heard it here, folks. Vincent Tanda has coined the first instance of the Price is Right political model of bargaining.
There you go. They just have to be careful. They've done a lot of good work, and they need to continue to fight, because I truly believe in the ideals they are standing for. But there is a stark warning, and, just because you back down here or there doesn't mean you're turncoats. You have to play your cards strategically. And I think what's in the horizon is this. They will come to an understanding that, we can't just continually shut down the Hong Kong airport, because things will get worse for us, and that is antithetical to what we want.
I guess, so looking out very far to the horizon, which will ultimately illustrate the point, Hong Kong only has a guaranteed, and by guaranteed I use that term very loosely, about 30 to 40 years of independence left, thanks to the nature of the treaty that they signed with the United Kingdom, territorially turning over Hong Kong to China. They agreed to a 50-year period, give or take. Well, it was 50 years. It's not give or take. The point is that it was
another 50 years.
Yeah.
I don't know. It was a British treaty. I feel like give or take fits in there.
That is true. You raise a good point. So ultimately, Hong Kong has a questionable legal status as an independent and special administrative zone of China. I think this points out to the Chinese, probably rightfully so, that as long as Hong Kong is a strong, independent financial center, it has the ability to resist the changes that Beijing really wants to influence on it in any capacity. So I think this is going to prove to Beijing probably pretty strongly that they need to start really trying to draw people more towards that Beijing market in order to basically weaken Hong Kong and then eventually absorb Hong Kong. I agree with the position that it's good what Hong Kong is doing. To fight for your civil liberties is the right thing to do. But they're fighting against Beijing, and they really don't have much to work with. If they want to keep this as a peaceful protest, Beijing's just not going to care. And Beijing is just going to be like, keep doing what you're doing, keep weakening yourself financially. Eventually, you'll just have to stop. And it's kind of a losing game for Hong Kong, no matter how they do it, unless they really can enlist international support to really start to squeeze China. Probably economically, if anything. But I just don't see there being a strong international willpower to do that over a small special administrative zone inside of China.
And just a tidbit, the Chinese have been trying to attract more international businesses towards a more stable Hong Kong, if you will, and that is in the city of Shenzhen. They're trying to make that the second Hong Kong. So they are doing what you've just said. It's not as successful yet. However, it is up and coming. So there's that.
Okay, sure. I guess I take a similar stance to Williams. Unfortunately, I don't really see too much of an outcome that doesn't involve Hong Kong eventually becoming, just a part of China. I think that you're kind of racing against time, or you're trying to stop time, which isn't really going to happen. I mean, considering that they have such strong ties to the UK, I think that in 6 years they'll do a hard no deal, and just leave. No, but this isn't something too much to make jokes about, because I think that things are actually just going to get I see so many articles that are Hong Kong people are reaching out to Trump, and I'm like, that's a terrible idea. I don't think any. Well, I think he's the only person who would probably help at this point in time. And I hate to say it, but nonviolence, I don't think is going to work out in the long run. No, I agree with that. It's the only. So the reason that I'm not faithful in the Trump idea is that I don't have the source on me right now, but he came out and he made some comments that strongly suggested that if he were in Xi Jinping's position, he would use some sort of force to deal with the Hong Kong problem, which is it came across very much as a silent admission, but not admission of if I were you, I would be already using military force.
Kind of he tacitly supports
exactly, which is just that's just not
I mean, we talked a lot about what China had to fear from international pressure, but given the trade deal being negotiated between Washington and Beijing, maybe Washington is a little afraid of reprisals. Blake, let's go to you for our final word.
Cool. I'm actually going to flip the script on basically everything you all have said. That I think that this is actually I think China done goofed here, because Britain keeps blustering back and forth about if you touch Hong Kong, we're gonna be real mad. No. I think, and China has rightfully responded along diplomatic channels of dude, whatever. But I think that they've let this go on for too long. I think that they've let this grab too much international attention. And as much as everybody's talking about, maybe China's going to be able to pivot their economic sectors to Shenzhen or to Beijing or to some other more Chinese-controlled city, I don't think that that's even remotely feasible, at least on the scale that would make absorbing Hong Kong entirely a possibility. A lot of Hong Kong's successful business, which translates to both tax revenue and international prowess, prestige, and power for the Chinese government, is due to their different economic code and setup, and could not be replicated elsewhere in China without massive economic reforms. it's also worth mentioning that China has a really large oligarchic class that has developed in the last 15 years or so. You're talking about the guy who founded Alibaba. We're talking about, all of the Chinese oligarchs that are in charge that sort of bought up the national-owned businesses when they pseudo-liberalized, and are still very much attached to the Communist Party, but are corrupt as all hell, and love Hong Kong because they get to go and vacation there, because it's a lot easier to be a spendy oligarch in a town with liberal economic foundations. So I think that they flinched because of those two things, the economic powerhouse that Hong Kong is, and the fact that some government officials like that freedom of money movement. And I think that flinch was just enough time to get the international community involved, which further reinforces in the mind of the international community, be it the UN or just other national governments, that Hong Kong is somehow not only legally but culturally and practically distinct from China. And every time that idea gets reinforced, it is harder and harder in 50 years, or whatever the remaining balance is, 34, for the Chinese government to just sort of absorb Hong Kong. And I think that when it comes time that they're able to do that, they're going to find it very, very difficult to do. So I think that these protests have made pretty major ground in preventing... If China had moved on day one to just sort of declare martial law, put the troops in, and put it down, I think there would have been international outcry for about 2 days and then nothing. Now I think that Hong Kong has fully solidified itself as an independent entity that is going to be hard for the international community to let China swallow.
Okay, so ending our episode on a little bit of measured optimism. Thank you guys so much for sticking with us. We'll see you next time.